Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 499. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got quite a bit of news to get through on today's show, so be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And of course, everything I work on is posted on X or Twitter at my account, Kyle Anzalone _. So with that, let's get into the news today. The first story here I wrote for the Institute on November 13th. Ukrainian soldiers training in Europe face grim future on the battlefield. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been trained across Europe for the war with Russia. French trainers say they are careful not to get too close to the Ukrainian cadets over fears they will be killed on the frozen front lines. The AP reported that Ukrainian soldiers preparing for deployment have resigned themselves to the grimness of the future. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. and its partners have trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. Many of these troops have been killed along relatively stagnant front lines. Moscow has pushed Kiev into using high casualty tactics, even when the U.S. assessed Ukraine was unlikely to make any breakthroughs. Members of the European Union are on pace to train 35,000 troops in 2023. 7,000 Ukrainians have learned battlefield maneuvers from French instructors. Captain Xavier, a French trainer, says it is important not to get too close to trainees. He explained, "You have to burn bridges because otherwise you ask yourself too many questions. When you find out that this person or that person is dead, you're bound to ask yourself, what did you do wrong? Did we work enough on this or that tactic? Should I have insisted more on this point?" According to the Associated Press, the Ukrainian soldiers preparing to leave France for the battlefield are aware of the, quote, grimness that awaits them. This is what the AP reported. With their return to Ukraine just days away, the grimness of the future that awaits these trainees at the French base was perceptible in the men's determined, unsmiling looks. The conflict has dragged on and turned into a war of attrition, and Kiev has become increasingly desperate for men to conscript into its armed forces. The Ukrainians training in France were recently civilians unprepared for the war. French trainers say that troops have engaged in tactics while firing blanks and throwing training grenades. Additionally, the instructors placed animal carcasses on the training field to get the soldiers familiar with blood and gore. So, this is, I guess, not really surprising, I'm sure, to anyone who's listening to this show and everything that we've talked about over the past year and a half with Ukraine. But I think it is important to note that, this kind of rhetoric is now coming out of the Associated Press. This is what they are reporting. And just, how bleak it is from the perspective of all involved. The trainers know that the soldiers are going to die. The soldiers know that they're going to die. Of course, we could hold negotiations and try to end this whole thing, but nobody in power, Biden, Zelensky, etc., want that. All right, so next up here, Europe opens F-16 training center for Ukrainian pilots. On the last show, I had mentioned that Ukrainian officials said that Ukrainian pilots were now training in the air on F-16s. I'm not sure if that means they're flying the plane or if there's like an instructor flying the plane and they're flying alongside, learning different maneuvers, tactics, how it actually works in the plane versus a simulator. So lots of questions still exactly what's going on. The timeline is still next spring at the earliest, I think, but we have another development in this story. Facility to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets was officially opened in Romania on Monday as NATO countries are continuing to work to get the U.S.-made warplanes to the battlefield in Ukraine. The Roman Defense Ministry said the center will be an international hub for training F-16 pilots and will facilitate increased interoperability among allies. And so it kind of sounds like even post war in Ukraine, they're going to continue to operate this thing and train pilots of different nationalities on F-16s across Europe. Ukrainian pilots started training on F-16s elsewhere in Europe earlier this year. The Pentagon said in October that training had also started at a U.S. National Guard base in Arizona. My understanding is that almost all of the training is going to be happening in Romania. There's only a handful of pilots in the United States, and I think in the UK as well, but most of the training is planned to be done in Romania. The Netherlands sent 5 of its F-16s to the training center in Romania earlier this month. The training center in Romania will first use the aircraft to provide a refresher course for the hired F-16 instructors, which will begin providing training to the Romanian and Ukrainian pilots. The aircraft will only be flown in NATO airspace. This is all according to the Dutch government. So that's interesting. Suggests that the process may be drug out a little bit longer here, just to get the trainers more familiar with the planes before actually having the Ukrainians start to learn on the systems. The opening of the training center comes amid signs that Ukraine might be struggling to maintain Western support for its war with Russia. A recent poll from NBC News said the U.S. had finally broached the idea of peace talks with Ukraine after over a year and a half of discouraging negotiations. All right, I have one more article here on the Ukraine situation. This one I wrote for the Institute on November 13th. U.S. to buy anti-aircraft weapons for Ukraine at huge markup. Jordan is said to make a massive profit by selling its Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft systems to the U.S. For anybody who's watching, I wasn't familiar with this weapon system, so I have a picture of it here on top. It kind of looks like the kind of tank maybe a kid will draw, with turrets on each side of it. They're obviously pointed upwards, I guess, most of the time, as this is an anti-aircraft weapon. Looks like it has some kind of radar attached to the back of it. It was made, I believe, by Germany in the 1970s. These particular weapons that the U.S. is now buying were first sold to the Netherlands and then to Jordan. And we'll get into all that in a second here. These systems I've also seen called cheetahs. So I'll just use cheetah because it's a little bit easier to say. The White House plans to send the weapons to arm Ukraine once they acquire them. In 2013, Jordan purchased the weapons for $22 million, and now the U.S. will pay Jordan nearly $120 million to buy the anti-aircraft systems for Ukraine. According to De Telegraaf, the largest Dutch daily morning newspaper, the Netherlands sold 60 Leopards to the Jordanians in 2023 for about 350,000 euros each. At the time, it indeed involved a total amount of 21 million euros, while the Americans will now pay 1.8 million euros each for it, and that works out to, my calculations was $126 million. So Hans Brewmister, a Dutch brigadier general and military professional, said the increase in price was due to the steep demand for weapons caused by multiple conflicts being fought around the globe. The situation in the world then was fundamentally different than it is now. The geopolitical situation has changed, and that may affect the price of these cheetahs, he explained. As the war in Ukraine has dragged on and Israel has urged the U.S. for more weapons, the demand for arms has continued to increase. Washington has been pressed to find artillery shells and air defense systems, which are both in demand by Kiev and Tel Aviv. My understanding from some quotes from defense officials is they believe these cheetahs will be effective in shooting down drones. No idea if that's true or not, but that's what they plan to give them to Ukraine for. A former Pentagon employee has warned that the Department of Defense is being price gouged for weapons. And he said this earlier this year. Shay Shad, who was a former contract negotiator with the Department of Defense for over 4 decades, said, "The gouging that takes place is unconscionable. There is no doubt about it. You can only buy so much because you only have so much money. And that's what I say. Is it really any different than not giving a Marine enough bullets to put in his clip? It's the same thing." And what Assad's really talking about here is sales from American defense manufacturers. But I think, looking at this particular sale, we have to wonder if this price gouging is occurring on the international stage as well. I will say the last possibility that I thought of here was maybe this is essentially a bribe being paid to the Jordanian government right now to try to keep that government complacent as Israel levies a huge toll on the people of Gaza. And of course, there's millions and millions of Palestinian refugees living in Jordan that do put pressure on the government to try to do anything, about what's happening there. All right, a couple stories here on the Biden-Xi summit that will occur today on Wednesday in San Francisco. This first article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. No breakthroughs expected at Xi-Biden summit amid soaring tensions. The New York Times reported on Tuesday that Biden administration officials said one potential agreement that might be made is to resume military-to-military communications channels that were suspended in the wake of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan in August of 22. But even the increased military dialogue is not guaranteed. The U.S. previously framed its efforts to restore communications channels as guardrails to manage the frequent encounters between the two militaries in the South China Sea and near Taiwan. From Beijing's perspective, the U.S. to establish guardrails will normalize the U.S. increasing military presence in the region. And so basically, the U.S. wants to have more communications with China just so we could carry out more military operations in the water surrounding China. Obviously, that doesn't make China more interested in communication. And so it doesn't look like this is something that alone China would agree to. Maybe there are some other things the U.S. could do to get China to have more communications with the U.S. Although a lot of the problems with the lack of communications between the U.S. and China is, in the U.S. camp, not just for doing provocative things and having the Chinese back away from communications, but if you remember the weather balloon that flew over the U.S., Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a pretty important trip to China about that, when both Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of I want to say Interior, that's Yellen and Gina Raimondo, they both basically went to China and said that, we had to maintain our economic war with you over national security issues, which I don't think is what Beijing was hoping to hear, and that caused some tensions. The first meeting between China and U.S. officials under the Biden administration occurred in Alaska, and that turned into a shouting match over the U.S. coming out and just blistering China over human rights abuses, which China then fired back at the U.S. And of course, recently, you had a lack of communications between the U.S. and the Chinese Defense Ministry, the Pentagon, U.S. Department of Defense, over the fact that the previous Chinese Defense Minister Li was actually sanctioned by the U.S. So this isn't looking particularly positive. Now, I do have a quote here from Biden where he just says he hopes that communications could get back to normal after this meeting. I don't know if the White House really understands how far the situation has deteriorated, how provocative the Biden statement saying that the U.S. Taiwan will defend Taiwan have been, the treatment of the Chinese, particularly around the weather balloon issue, have all really impacted the U.S.-China relationship. And I don't think it's as simple as flipping a switch as what Biden seems to be suggesting. All right, let's get into the war in Gaza here. And we have a slate of stories to talk about dealing with U.S. and other government officials demanding the higher ups in their government do something about, or at least stop supporting Israel so much, just dissenting to their policy of supporting Israel. This is particularly in the U.S. So the first article up here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, more than 400 U.S. officials from 40 government agencies have sent a letter to President Biden criticizing his unconditional support for Israel's war in Gaza in the latest example of dissent from within the U.S. government. The letter reads, "We call on President Biden to urgently demand a ceasefire and call for de-escalation of the current conflict by securing the immediate release of Israeli hostages and arbitrarily detained Palestinians, the restoration of water, fuel, electricity, and other basic services, and the passage of adequate humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip." According to the New York Times, the majority of the signatories to the letter are political appointees who work throughout the government, including the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Security Council. Some signatories helped to get Biden elected and said they are worried that his support for the onslaught in Gaza was not opposed by the was now opposed by the majority of Democratic voters. The letter says that the overwhelming majority of Americans support a ceasefire, citing a poll from Data for Progress that found 66% of American voters believe the U.S. should push for a ceasefire, including 80% of Democrats. The letter says, furthermore, Americans do not want the U.S. military to be drawn to another costly and senseless war in the Middle East. President Biden and his top aides have called for pauses in the fighting, but have refused to use the term ceasefire, demonstrating they are committed to continuing the support for Israel, which has killed at least 11,000 Palestinians, including over 4,500 children. Since October 7th, the U.S. has shipped weapons to Israel on a near daily basis and is providing special operations support, including surveillance drone flights over Gaza. Besides the new letter, Biden's full-throated support for the brutal war has drawn 3 distinct memos from the State Department employees and an open letter signed by more than 1,000 employees of the U.S. Agency for International Development, that's USAID. Let's talk a little bit about the most recent State Department memo. A State Department dissent memo that was obtained by Axios slammed President Biden's support for Israel's war in Gaza, saying the U.S. was backing Israeli war crimes. The memo was signed by 100 State Department and USAID employees and says the U.S. should reassess its policy towards Israel and called for a ceasefire in Gaza, where over 11,000 Palestinians have been killed since Israel unleashed its bombing campaign. According to Axios, the memo was organized by a foreign affairs officer who previously said on social media that President Biden is complicit in genocide by supporting Israel's war. The memo says that Israel's actions all constitute war crimes and or crimes against humanity under international law, and the letter criticizes the U.S. for doubling down on our unwavering military assistance to the Israeli government without clear or actionable red lines. President Biden was targeted in the memo for spreading misinformation and questioning the number of deaths coming from the Gaza Health Ministry. Since Biden accused the Palestinians of lying about the death toll, a senior State Department official said the number is actually likely higher than is what is being reported. And this is probably a good time to mention that the way the Palestinians have been counting deaths in Gaza is by actually counting dead bodies that they receive. Now, people have been killed in very violent, brutal, explosive ways. And so it's not impossible that there have been people who are either identified as being killed in Gaza who are misidentified, or people who maybe bodies that were counted twice because different pieces of them were found, horrific things like that, right? But they're actually counting deaths. They're not counting estimates. They're not saying that, 30 people lived in that building right there. Family members say that 20 of those people are missing. And while we can't dig under the rubble to know for sure at this time, we're going to assume they're dead. They're not doing that. The people that are still buried have not been counted yet. And so the Barbara Leaf, the State Department employee, explained that the number could be higher as they find more bodies. However, the Gaza reporting system, where there was a central person who was receiving the tallies from different morgues and hospitals and I guess other probably facilities, maybe schools where a lot of dead bodies were showing up in Gaza, were calling this particular point person every day and reporting the number of deaths. So, it's not impossible that there's a morgue director here or there that's lying about the number of deaths, inflating the total a little bit, but there's no evidence behind that at this point. And again, when you look at the number of people that are still buried under the rubble, the number is likely much higher. But at this point, the communications in Gaza have been so debilitated, and on top of that, power outages at hospitals, bombings of hospitals, sieges of hospitals have really made it that I don't think that this information could be communicated. So my guess is that death toll is going to stagnate around 11,000, 12,000 for the next at least few days, if not weeks, until that reporting system is reestablished, likely in a different location than it is now. So anyways, back to the letter here. Members of the White House and the National Security Council display a clear disregard for the lives of Palestinians, a documented unwillingness to de-escalate, and even prior to October 7th, a reckless lack of strategic foresight. The memo was submitted to the State Department on November 3rd through the dissent channel that was established during the Vietnam War to give diplomats a way to criticize policy. The latest sign of significant opposition to the Biden's full-throated support for the Israeli war in Gaza. So in the dissent is coming, I think, mostly from the State Department here. Last week, Politico reported on a separate dissent memo that called for the U.S. to push for a ceasefire and for the Biden administration to publicly criticize Israel's tactics. The Huffington Post reported earlier that a mutiny was brewing in the State Department. So we also have aid groups sending a letter to the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. A group of U.S.-based aid groups, advocacy groups, and religious groups sent a letter to Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, urging the Pentagon to scrap plans to provide Israel with 155mm artillery rounds due to the massive civilian casualty rate in Israel's war on Gaza. The Pentagon plans to give the Israeli military access to 155mm shells that the U.S. has in special stockpile locations around Israel. The U.S. has recently dipped into the stash to support its proxy war in Ukraine. According to a recent report from Axios, the U.S. is now delivering shells initially bound for Ukraine to replenish the stockpile. And then this is from the letter. Under the current circumstances, granting the government of Israel access to these munitions would undermine the protection of civilians, respect for international humanitarian law, and the credibility of the Biden administration. Simply put, it is difficult to imagine a scenario in which high explosive 155mm artillery shells could be used in Gaza with compliance of international humanitarian law. Since October 7th, Hamas' attack on southern Israel, the U.S. has been rushing weapon shipments to Israel to back its assault on Gaza. The Pentagon has said that it's sending arms on a near daily basis, but the U.S. won't detail what it's sending to Israel. There was an article by Bloomberg with a little bit of an outline, and I will get into that either later in this show or the next episode. NBC News reported last month that the weapons shipments have included interceptors for the Iron Dome air defenses, JDAM conversion kits to turn dumb bombs into precision-guided munitions, and other types of munitions, including cluster bombs, which are notorious for killing civilians. And the NBC report was, just a part of its Gaza war feed, and I did not see that report anywhere. I was actually just kind of looking at cluster bomb use potentially by Israel, and I stumbled across this story. So my tweet on it has actually gotten quite a good amount of attention, just because I don't think many people realize that the U.S. is sending Israel cluster bombs, in part because the U.S. has been intentionally quiet about what it's sending Israel, but it just seems like that one NBC report is the one that mentioned it, that actually paid attention to what was going on. All right, there's one more memo here. This one is from a Dutch defense official in Israel who says that Support for Israel violates international treaties and laws of war and increases the chance of regional escalation. So in a memo, the Dutch defense attaché in Israel said the bombings have the intention of deliberately causing massive destruction to the infrastructure and civilian centers in Gaza, targeting houses, bridges, roads, and causing massive civilian casualties, which explains the high number of deaths among civilians. The Dutch official said his government is aware of the ruthless approach, but refuses to offer a condemnation. And so just to show a little bit there that this does extend beyond Washington, this is something that other Western governments are starting to realize too, at least some of their officials based in Israel. All right, so next up here, Speaker Mike Johnson calls the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza outrageous at a pro-Israel rally. So the House Speaker Mike Johnson and other members of Congress spoke at a pro-Israel rally at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, where demonstrators made clear their opposition to a ceasefire in Gaza. Johnson called the idea of a ceasefire outrageous, prompting a chant of no ceasefire from the crowd. Israel will clear their counteroffensive when Hamas ceases to be a threat to the Jewish state, Johnson said. The rally was a bipartisan affair featuring speakers from Democrat members of Congress, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Representative Torres, and John Fetterman, who of course is the senator from Pennsylvania. In his speech, Torres declared that support for Israel is an American value. He said the U.S.-Israel relationship is not just Democratic or Republican value, it is not a progressive or conservative value, it is an American value encoded in our national DNA. Again, it's always crazy that these politicians will make statements like, without Israel, there wouldn't be an America. America was founded 200 years before Israel. So please explain to me how we needed Israel to found America when America was founded. Israel was nothing but a land, used by Palestinians. So, Torres also expressed opposition to a ceasefire. He said, "I want to be clear. Ceasefire with a terrorist organization is not a peace agreement, it's a death sentence for Israel." Schumer expressed his strong support for Israel, opening his speech by leading a chant of "We stand with Israel." He said, "America feels your pain. We ache with you. We stand with you. We will not rest until you get all the assistance that you need." And again, at this point, Israel is just launching a massive slaughter in Gaza. They pretend like Hamas is still running around southern Israel. Just not the case. And also at this meeting, Van Jones said something about bringing an end to the fighting, and he started getting jeered from the crowd, and they started chanting "no ceasefire" at him, even though he's speaking at this pro-Israel rally. They do not want peace. The supporters of Israel have been very clear that they want this war to continue, and you really have to wonder if they're all just kind of thinking to themselves that at this point we need to resolve the situation in Gaza. And if that means kicking out all the Palestinians, then that's what it means. And it definitely seems like that's the path that's going down. Also, I guess Van Jones put out a tweet saying that he was so rattled by the people jeering him that he meant to call for an end to Israeli and Palestinian hate, but he just called for an end to is hate for Israelis, but then just called for an end to the Palestinians. And she would think one made the crowd happy, but all right, next up here, Ilhan Omar to introduce bill to block weapons transfers to Israel. So Representative Omar is expected this week to introduce a bill to block arms transfers to Israel, which will mark the first piece of legislation aimed at reining in President Biden's strong support for Israel's brutal war in Gaza. The bill will target a planned $320 million transfer of Spice family gliding bomb assembly kits that turn unguided bombs into precision-guided munitions. So they must be something like JDAMs. The Biden administration notified congressional leaders on October 31st that it intended to go through with the transfer amid Israel's onslaught in Gaza. Omar's plans were first reported by the Huffington Post, which said the bill will likely be introduced by Wednesday. A source told the Huffington Post that the legislation will likely be co-sponsored by a group of Democrats. The bill will be a resolution of disapproval that will block the transfer if approved by both the House and Senate, but it's not expected to pass due to strong bipartisan support for the Israeli war. So, no expectation that this will pass, but it will be interesting to get a count in Congress and also to see if there's any Republicans willing to stand up on this issue. All right, next up here, article I wrote for the Institute on November 14th. Tel Aviv refuses Western request to allow aid into Gaza through Israel. Officials in Tel Aviv had denied requests from some Western nations to bring aid into Gaza through an Israeli crossing. Israel has allowed a small amount of aid to enter Gaza through Egypt. The aid making it into the besieged enclave is only a tiny portion of what is required to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Tel Aviv requires trucks to pass an inspection at the Israel-Egypt border before proceeding into Gaza through the Rafah crossing. And so aid is in Israel, passes the border crossing from Israel into Egypt, travels from Egypt into Gaza, right? In recent days, aid that flows into Gaza through Egypt has been slow because of a backup inside Israel. So that inspections point inside Israel is what is holding up the aid. Western countries have asked Tel Aviv to allow aid to pass from Israel through the Karim Shalom checkpoint. This is directly from Israel into Gaza. This is just where Israel and Gaza are separated by the prison fence. So according to Haaretz, Tel Aviv has rejected the proposal because it does not want to take any responsibility for the Palestinians in Gaza who have been displaced by the Israeli military operations. Israel opposes the idea, the outlet reports. Despite pressures applied by Western countries, Israeli sources say that Jerusalem objects because it wants to renounce any responsibility for civil matters inside the Gaza Strip. So basically, they just want to be able to murder people. They don't want to allow aid at all into Gaza. And of course, the point of that is to kill more Palestinians, right? If you go a couple months without allowing food, water, fuel, medicine into Palestine, guess what? The very young and the very old are going to start dropping dead very quickly. Haaretz explained that while Israel's refusing to create the Israeli refusal is creating some anger in Western countries. The outlet reports, if there is going to be a check of goods at the Karim Shalom anyways, the most logical thing is to bring the goods in through there. We understand Israel's position, but and then Western diplomat said, we understand Israel's position, but there is an attempt to avert a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. If there are thousands more dead there, or heaven forbid an epidemic breaks out, the world will blame Israel. It's in your interest to streamline the aid. After the Hamas attack on southern Israel on October 7th, Israel imposed a complete siege of Gaza. The next day, Tel Aviv launched a massive military operation in Gaza that has decimated the small enclave's infrastructure. A small number of aid trucks have entered Gaza, but groups have described the amount of aid as severely insufficient. Since imposing the siege, Israel has not allowed any fuel into Gaza. On Tuesday, Axios reported speaking with U.S. and Israeli military officials who say that some fuel will be allowed into the strip this week, although it's unclear if that's actually going to happen. The United Nations Agency for Palestine, their Commissioner General Philippe Lazarani, explained that the situation inside of Gaza was becoming increasingly desperate. He said, we have heavily rationed the use of fuel and accessed pre-existing limited amounts stored in a depot inside the Gaza Strip through close coordination with Israeli authorities. That depot is now empty. It is unbelievable that humanitarian agencies have to beg for fuel and operate on life support. Since the beginning of the war, fuel has been used as a weapon of war. This should stop immediately. The Biden administration has tried to focus on the aid it is providing to Palestinians amid a flurry of criticisms that the Israeli military operations in Gaza have killed at least 46,000 civilian children in just 5 weeks. Now let's talk about the Al-Shifa Hospital. This is pre-bombing the largest medical facility in Gaza, and now it is basically decimated. My understanding is, by the way, I don't have any written updates on this, so this is just going to be what I was able to piece together from some early reporting, so I won't have many details. But the Israeli military did conduct a raid. They put forces on the ground. They sent forces into the hospital, and there have been reports that shots were fired. No idea what's going to happen beyond that. Now, look, hospitals in war zones typically have a policy that they just treat people, right? And so this hospital, if they were able to accept new patients, which I don't believe they are right now, but say they were able to accept new patients, and somebody got rushed in and that person is a Hamas fighter, they're going to treat that person the same way. If somebody got rushed in, it was an Israeli soldier, they're going to treat that person as well. There were times in Afghanistan, I believe, where the U.S. conducted raids and attacks on hospitals, and will often claim that, there's Taliban members inside, and the groups would say, well, we just treat whoever shows up as long as they're not armed, I suppose. All right, so Dave's article here says that doctors at the Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital are pleading for help as the medical facility has ceased functioning after power failed over the weekend amid an Israeli siege. The medical staff has refused to evacuate the hospital due to fears that the approximately 700 patients they would leave behind will die. Among the at-risk patients are newborns and premature babies who are taken off incubators due to a power outage. The head of the hospital told ABC News that the hospital's plastic surgery told ABC News that 3 out of the 39 babies in the hospital's neonatal unit have died since the incubator stopped working on Saturday. A neonatal ologist said that she expects all the babies to die due to lack of clean water to mix the formula. She said most of them are preterm babies who need incubators, who need electricity, who need special food, who need care. We expect all to die because they don't have water to prepare the formula for them. 3 of the babies who died were among the 32 patients Gaza Health Ministry said lost their lives in the past 3 days due to the power outages and the Israeli siege. Israel is justifying its attack on the hospital by claiming there's a Hamas command center underneath the facility, a claim that is strongly denied by Hamas and hospital staff. One of the doctors said, the tanks are in front of the hospital. We are under full blockade. It is a totally civilian area. Only hospital facility, hospital patients, doctors, and other civilians staying in the hospital. Someone should stop this. They bombed the water tanks. They bombed the water wells. They bombed the oxygen pumps as well. They bombed everything in the hospital, so we are hardly surviving. We tell everyone the hospital is no more a safe place for treating patients. We are harming patients by keeping them here, he added. Now, just the one thing that I wanted to add to that statement was there are thousands of people sheltering on the grounds. And so it is possible that there is a few members of Hamas within the crowds of people who are, at the hospital trying to take shelter. I'm sure, some Hamas fighters guy, his mom is in there or something like that. He's hanging out outside. It's not that they're conducting any kind of operations there. I just they say, there's no Hamas here at all. And so then if Israel arrests some young man who they claim is a member of Hamas, it may or may not be true. And it shouldn't be a condemnation or any kind of justification for what Israel is doing here if they pick a few alleged members of Hamas out of the crowd. The medical charity Doctors Without Borders put out a press release on Monday after getting in contact with its surgeons in the hospital. The surgeon detailed the situation at the hospital. They said, we don't have electricity. There is no water in the hospital. There is no food. People will die in a few hours without functioning ventilators. In front of the main gate, there are many bodies. There are also injured patients. We cannot bring them inside. When we send ambulance to bring other patients a few meters away, they attack the ambulance. There are also people people around the hospital looking for medical care. We can't bring them inside. There's also a sniper who attacked patients. They have gunshot wounds. We operate on 3 of them. They're talking about snipers firing into the hospital, by the way, there. So the surgeon said the medical staff needs a guaranteed safe corridor to evacuate the hospital because people who have tried to leave were killed. Inside the Al-Shifa hospital, there are injured patients and medical teams. If they give us guarantees and evacuate the patients first, we will evacuate, the surgeon said. This is unbelievable, right? That the U.S. is currently backing Israel as it lays siege to the largest hospital in Gaza. Just very few words. So this is, I believe I found it at the Miami Herald, and it's just a short little thing I tweeted out here, but I did want to throw it up here for you guys because this is apparently a development. This was, by the way, supposed to happen before the Israeli raid on the hospital grounds. And so if this got disrupted because of the raid, that's a possibility too, but around 180 decomposing bodies at the Al-Shifa hospital will be buried in a mass grave at the hospital. Lack of fuel to run generators and Israeli strikes have killed patients, including newborn babies inside the hospital. There are about 700 patients still inside the facility. So just understand that the actual hell that these people are living through, that they are opening up mass graves at a hospital because the bodies are decomposing and they have nowhere else to put them. All right, so next up here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, Hamas says it discussed freeing 70 hostage in exchange for a 5-day truce. Hamas's armed wing said Monday that it discussed with Qatari mediators a deal to free up to 70 Israeli hostages in exchange for a 5-day ceasefire and the release of some Palestinian prisoners. Last week, there was an effort from the Qatari brothers to release the enemy captives from women and children in return for the release of 200 Palestinian women and 200 Palestinian children and 75 women detained by the enemy, a spokesperson for the Al-Qassam brigades said, according to Reuters. The truce should include a complete ceasefire and allow humanitarian relief everywhere in the Gaza Strip. The spokesperson added that Israel was procrastinating and evading the price of the deal. On Monday, David Ignatius of the Washington Post reported that Israel and Hamas are close to a hostage deal that would free almost all women and children. The general outline of the deal is understood, the Israeli official said. The report said that Israel is hoping 100 people will be freed. So, from my understanding, the group of people that Hamas might release are the women, the children, and anybody who is in need of more urgent medical care than they can provide. I guess, from Hamas's position, the people probably lose, the hostages probably lose a lot of value if they die. And so exchanging them while they are still alive would probably be beneficial. And then, of course, gain the women and children out of there is a good thing as well. And of course, gain the release of the Palestinian political prisoners would be great as well. Not sure if this is actually going to happen though, especially because of the length of the ceasefire. 5 days, people might be done with this war by the time Israel wants to pick it back up. Oh, by the way, I should mention, I don't think I've said this on the show, that Israel revised down the Israeli death toll from October 7th to about 1,200 Israelis. So it was sitting at 1,400 for about the past month. And, when I've talked about this before with the Palestinian side, when we talk about, how many people have died or are dying in these situations, in a way, it almost doesn't matter. I think to 95% of Americans I talk to, if I tell them, 400, 500, or 1,000 Palestinians are dead, they don't care. It doesn't make a difference between the numbers. Dead people are dead people, and especially once you get over 100, I think it kind of all blurs around. And so I don't think that, Israel really generated all that much more support by inflating the number by a couple hundred people. So my point was, I don't know if that's a nefarious mistake by Israel. I think they just overcounted and counted a lot of the dead Hamas fighters as Israelis. Next up here, I tweeted this out on November 13th, and so the number is likely higher now, but the UN says that 100 of its staff have been killed in Gaza. More than 100 United Nations employees have been killed in Israel's war on Gaza, the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency said on Friday, marking it the deadliest conflict ever for the UN in such a short period of time. In an effort to justify the massive death toll on aid workers, Israeli ambassador, I believe to the UN, Ed Erden said many UNRWA workers in Gaza are members of Hamas. Just propaganda, but this is kind of the blank check that the U.S. has given Israel, is to say that if anything is Hamas, then we could do whatever we want. We could kill whoever we want. All right. Last story here today. I wrote for the Institute. Israel. What we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut. So the Israeli defense minister threatened to launch a war in Lebanon that would resemble the military operations in Gaza. Israeli forces have waged a brutal assault and blockade of the enclave. Tel Aviv's bombing has killed over 11,000 Palestinian civilians, including 4,000 children. The White House is concerned that if Israel goes to war in Lebanon, it will provoke a wider conflict involving the U.S. On Sunday, the Israeli defense minister said, "What we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut." After Tel Aviv began its military operations in Gaza last month, Hezbollah and the Israeli military began exchanging fire along the border. Scores of people have been killed, including soldiers and civilians, reportedly on each side. I know there have been more Lebanese civilians killed and fighters, members of either Hezbollah or Palestinian militant groups that are in Lebanon than Israeli soldiers. In fact, I just saw this morning a report that from Human Rights Watch that said that I believe it was 3 young Lebanese women and their grandmother traveling in a car were hit with an Israeli airstrike. So, just a slaughter of innocent civilians by Israelis in Lebanon. No need for further concern from the U.S. on that. And an Israeli airstrike caused the death of a Lebanese journalist. So the Israeli defense minister's threat to model operations in Lebanon after those in Gaza is concerning due to the brutality of the Israeli operations. 11,000 dead at least, with thousands more believed to be dead, buried under the rubble. Israeli forces have also laid siege to hospitals and bombed other shelters housing displaced Palestinians. Tel Aviv has caused a massive humanitarian catastrophe for the 2.3 million residents of the Strip. Israel cut fuel, water, food, and medical aid to the enclave. Tel Aviv has refused requests from Western nations to allow them to bring aid directly from Israel into Gaza. Tel Aviv is enforcing a tedious inspections regime of aid trucks entering Gaza through the Egyptian crossing, causing delays. And it sounds kind of like Israel is modeling their inspections regime after what Saudi Arabia did in Yemen, where international aid ships can't bring aid directly into Yemen. First, they have to pass inspections at the port in Jeddah before they could then proceed to Hadada in Yemen. And this causes large backups and makes it more difficult to get aid into these areas. Back to my article here. Several Israeli officials have boasted that their operations in Gaza amount to ethnic cleansing campaign. The agricultural minister said it is first and almost an operational event. We have a huge number of fighters of our own that have to operate in a densely populated area. We need to reduce the number of residents. This is going to result in some sort of Nakba. This is a Gaza Nakba 2023. This is how it ends. And of course, the Nakba refers to the founding of Israel and the mass displacement of Palestinians in 1948. 80% of the people who live in Gaza are refugees from other areas of Palestine. Many of those people became refugees in 1948 when Israeli militants drove them off of their land, pushing basically all the Palestinians into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which has, been slowly eroded away, and the Israelis have largely held a military occupation over those regions since 1967. In Washington, officials are concerned that Tel Aviv will drag the U.S. into a conflict in Lebanon. Axios report that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin expressed concern to his Israeli counterpart that fighting on the Israeli-Lebanon border could lead to a wider war. The White House requested Austin relay the message due to growing anxiety that the Israeli military action is exacerbating tensions on the border. While the Biden administration has expressed concern about some of Tel Aviv's actions in Gaza and Lebanon, Washington is refusing to condition any of the military support it provides to Israel on a reduction of civilian casualties or de-escalation. And so it shows they, really don't care about de-escalation or anything like that. It's just lip service, because this is going to turn out to be an ethnic cleansing campaign at the very least, if not just a full-on genocide. And the Biden administration prefers to support Israel, but also wants to be able to pretend to stand for democratic values. And so you can't be a country that supports genocide and stand for democratic values. And so the Biden administration is going to pay lip service to ideas of de-escalation, humanitarian pauses, allowing aid into Gaza, but really it's just cover so the U.S. and Israel could continue to obliterate the Palestinian people. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Back with more later in the week.